Welcome back. Good morning, Richard. It's good to see
Good
you again.
morning. How are you?
I am doing swell this
We're
morning.
sliding into the end of September, aren't we?
Yeah, we're on the downhill side of the month, and
Fast approaching.
and then moving into the downhill side of the year already.
Holiday season, fast approaching. You can tell if you go into stores. I don't go into stores much, but if you go into stores, you see pumpkins.
Mhm.
So it's if it's pumpkins and turkeys can't be far behind. So
That's right. That's right. Well, today we are starting an at least two-part series
right.
on parenting.
Right.
It's a topic that it's parenting that we like talking about parenting because it's always such a hot topic when you're talking to or we're talking to patients or we're talking to families or whoever, and it's such an important thing for us to talk about because anytime people want you to work and change their teenagers and help kids, you have to start off by talking about parenting a little bit.
Right. And these podcasts were prompted by a guest essay in the New York Times by our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. And his essay, short essay, um, but he raises the question of parenting as a public health
Right.
issue. Um, we're eventually going to say a public health problem, public health dilemma, public health crisis. But for now, it's a public health issue. He published this guest essay in the New York Times back in August, late August, so just a few weeks ago. And incidentally, I heard yesterday on the way home that NPR is doing a special series on this topic. I think today, they're Shankar Vedantam, who does the Hidden Brain.
Hmm.
I think he's going to be part of that discussion. So it's beginning to get some play.
Hmm.
Uh, Although the essay was written by the Surgeon General, the study that he's referring to was undertaken by the American Psychological Association. So this is not just a political appointee. This is the American Psychological Association did this very extensive meta-analysis of parenting. And it was based on that all these articles were spawned based on that study, the recently published study by the American Psychological Association.
Yeah, absolutely. And the title of his essay is "Parents Are at Their Wits' End," but we can do better. And it's funny because when you and I were first talking about this article or this essay, we're like, no kidding.
That was exactly my response. I kind of groaned when I saw the first headline. I thought, yeah, really, parenting is stressful. Who would have guessed,
You know what? I don't know that any time in history anyone would have ever said parenting is stressful. Man,
No, there's nothing to
uh,
it. We have all these manuals about parenting. We know exactly what to do.
yeah.
Exactly what. No, I mean it's that was my initial reaction. I said, wait a minute, of course it's stressful. It's always been stressful. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, why is the Surgeon General weighing in on this issue?
Yeah.
Um, that seemed kind of odd. I said, is this politically oriented or what? But I began to read the essay, and I realized immediately when I first read it, I said, this guy's a parent.
Yeah.
And then in the article, he talks about a very risky surgery that his 1-year-old daughter had to endure. And he sat at her bedside for a couple of days because they didn't know whether the surgery was going to be effective or not. I think it's something to do with one of her legs. They didn't know whether the surgery was going to be successful or not. So he's not only a parent, but he's a parent who has already struggled with the one of the huge uh, problems, risks, dilemmas, dangers that we all face as parents, and that is taking care of a child where we have no control over what's going on, such as a medical problem.
Yeah.
Now, his friends told him when he first got pregnant, when his wife got when they were pregnant as a family, they said, "You're signing up for a lifetime of joy and worry, both." And he said, "This is the most stressful job I have ever had." Now,
Uh,
this guy's a physician. All right. So he's gone through college, he's gone through medical school, he's done his residency. Those are 80-hour week jobs, medical school and residency. And so, and he's also the Surgeon General of the United States. So now he has this
right.
um, important and very stressful um, job to do. So this guy knows about stress.
Well,
Okay.
and it's funny because things that we've said before is that, parenting is the most joyful, um, loving, stressful, difficult, torturous job that we ever voluntarily take on.
Yeah, who would?
We choose to do this.
Yeah, right. It's like having another baby. It's like I will never go through that again. And then you have three more kids, right?
Right?
And so it's a demanding, it has always been a demanding process.
Yeah.
And so this guy knows about children because he's been at his daughter's bedside while she's recovering from this surgery. He knows about stress. I mean, he's lived a stressful life all of his existence, academically and medically, and schedules and everything. So I said, maybe I'll keep reading. Well, as it turns out, he begins to cite these different data that come from the APA study. And the one that there are several that are striking. One of the 50% of parents are so stressed that they can't do anything else.
Right.
48% of parents say that on most days, their stress is completely overwhelming. 42% so stressed that they feel numb, 41% so stressed that they can't function. So we're talking about almost every other parent. So about half of all parents are so stressed that they can barely function. And this was the APA study, and I think we've cited that. If you want to read the study itself, we posted it in the notes, and you might want to take a look at that. It's not like I think it's about 30 pages or something, but they have all these data about stress, and we're going to be talking about stress. We began talking about it last week. We're going to continue to talk about it this week and next week about the effects of stress on our ability to function.
Right.
And so here's this one about, whoa, let's think about parents, the stress that they're under, and that they're completely overwhelmed. And if 48% are completely overwhelmed. So I thought, I wonder what percentage are mostly overwhelmed.
Right.
So we go
Yeah.
from 48% to 60. That would be, I couldn't find that anywhere. I looked at the study and I couldn't find other categories like mostly overwhelmed. But about 50% of all parents are completely overwhelmed.
Yeah. And it makes sense to some extent because we know that parenting is somewhat harder now.
Yeah.
There's more stressors, between and we are not going to sit here and put everything on a COVID or anything like that.
Mhm.
However, we're going to say that, it's more difficult because we're worrying about money, we're worrying about safety. Here in our school district here in Central Florida, the school year is only about 4 or 5 weeks long
Mhm.
so far. We've only been 4 or 5 weeks into the school year, and people may have to hold on to their hats with this one. We've already had 24 students arrested in
Mhm.
our county alone.
Just in our county.
Just in our
Mhm.
county, 24 students arrested for making threats, bomb threats, or school violence threats to shoot up schools and do those
Right.
kind of things. And so, parents are stressed about their kids' safety. They're stressed about school. We're not
Mhm.
getting enough sleep. All of these things are going on now that are more prevalent and more challenging now than they were, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And we were already starting to get more stressed at that time. So it makes sense that there's just more stressors and more things happening now that's really difficult for parents.
I was talking to parents the other day, and I said, well, my kids went to that school. And they said, yeah, but when did they go there? And I said, well, about 6 or 7 years ago. And they said, oh, that's a generation. It's
Yeah.
a completely
Completely
different school
different.
now. And so I talked to some of the teachers, and they verified that. They said, yes, it is a completely different curriculum, completely different approaches, and the problems are far worse than when your kids went to this school. And my kids went to that school 6 or 7 years ago,
Right.
and there's
Yeah.
been a sea change. So we have all the normal problems of parenting, like money and safety and getting them to school and back and getting enough sleep. But now we've added to that screen time, the media, the electronics, the mental health crisis that we hear about, and there's a fear of the future. The idea that you go to high school and you go to college and you get a job and everything works out well. That future doesn't exist today, and so parents are all that
Yeah.
existed in my day. If I went to college, I was pretty much assured that I was going to get a
Right.
decent job that I could have for the rest of my life. That kind of secure future no longer exists. So
Right.
it is harder. Okay. Parenting has more challenges today than ever.
Right. And what we really worry about is that we're doing things to actually make it even more difficult for ourselves because,
Right.
you know, with the way that our world is working right now, we spend more time in our jobs, more
Mhm.
time caring for our kids. Our kids stay in the homes much longer now than they did before. You know, we've talked many times before about how just a few decades ago, um, parents sent their kids outside on a Saturday morning and kids were gone all day and then they came back. But now kids are inside the home. And
Right.
it on some level, I think people will say, well, that, that's better because we're not stressed about, our kids' safety. I don't know that my parents were concerned about my safety all that much.
I can assure you, it's not that they didn't care. They just didn't have that much to worry about. I
Right,
mean, they knew where we were. We were in the neighborhood somewhere,
right.
and there were other parents kind of watching out for us. But I can assure you, my parents were not terribly concerned about where I was or what I was doing.
Right, right. And I have no idea what my parents did during that time. I'm sure that they were they were working obviously and some of those kind of things, but when we were gone, I have no idea what was happening at home. But so with our kids in the houses more, we talk to parents all the time and they just don't have a moment many
Right.
times don't even have a moment's rest or a
Right.
moment's respite from having to do something to entertain their children,
Right.
to make sure that they're out of trouble or that make sure that they're not harming themselves or breaking things and all this kind of stuff. And so we have less time for rest and leisure. We have less time for relationships. I think marriages are suffering because of some of this stuff. So
Mhm.
with all of these things, the stress, the loneliness, the exhaustion, all of this stuff is really contributing to this, again, as you mentioned a minute ago, this mental health and overall well-being crisis that we're experiencing right now with a significant increase in stress and anxiety and depression and all of these problems.
Right. And you just mentioned the three key words here that Murty is talking about. One is, yes, there is stress, increased stress, but the other is loneliness.
Mhm.
Parenting is a very lonely job for many people. I
Right.
mean, you're kind of on your own and you start having kids and your friends disappear unless you have play dates. But by and large, I mean, I was a house husband for a very short time, about 6 months one time. And it is a lonely undertaking because there are days and days and days that go by that you don't see anybody. You don't talk to anybody else except your child. So stress is one, loneliness and exhaustion.
Yeah.
We are working ourselves and parenting ourselves into a state of exhaustion. And all this leads to the stress, the kind of stress that he's talking about and that we're concerned about as mental health professionals.
Yeah. So when you think about this as a public health concern,
Right.
you know, it is, we think about other things that were public health concerns, right? Cigarettes and gun violence and drugs and all these kind of things. You know,
Hmm.
why should we be thinking about parenting uh,
Hmm.
and our roles as parents as a public health concern?
Right.
Well, I think that while it may seem odd, perhaps perhaps it is the right way to think about it. When you think about the influence and effect that stress and all of this has on our well-being, on
Hmm.
our ability to function, on our overall health, it
Hmm.
makes sense that this would be something that we focus on it from a public health perspective because my goodness, what else contributes this significantly to our stress levels? And
That's
we know
right.
that the effect of stress over time is worsening health. It's a dampening of our immune system. It is poor physical health, poor cardiovascular health, poor cardiac health. All of these things are affected by stress, and so the number one cause of stress, or one of the leading causes of stress, is parenting. So it should be on that list.
That's right. And in last week's podcast, we talked about stress and we emphasized that it doesn't matter why you get stressed.
Right.
You're going to have the same physiologic response. It doesn't matter whether there's a bear in the bushes or you haven't paid a bill.
Or
Our bodies react the same regardless of the stress. So if parenting creates this kind of stress, remember, 48% are completely overwhelmed. That's a lot of parents.
right.
If it's creating that kind of stress, maybe we should start to think about this as a public health crisis.
Right. And and because this hits close to home, literally, because you think about how much stress parents have with managing their kids and all this kind of stuff, and then you think about teachers. So not only do they have kids at home that's contributing to all that stress and everything, now they have
Right.
classrooms, middle and
Hmm.
high school teachers have 120, 150 students that they're
Hmm.
now worried about and that they're interacting with. And so it's a significant contributor to stress.
That's right. And if if we had bad food, we have these food recalls, or if we had tainted drinking water, or we had electricity outages because of a
Right.
hurricane, we would demand that somebody do something about that. Anything that's creating discomfort or stress, we would demand that somebody do something about it. And yet, when it comes to parenting, it's like, well, you're a parent. There isn't this outcry. And I think what Murty's um, contribution here is that he's saying maybe we ought to put parenting in this same category because it creates the same kind of stress as bad food or dangerous cars or drugs or opioids or whatever else is causing us problems.
Absolutely. And then hold on, because then you just imagine, the stress that you're experiencing, and a lot of what we're talking about are stress that parents experience when they have a typically healthy, well-developed, a child who's developing as would be anticipated. If you add on a chronic medical condition or developmental delays or learning disabilities or serious mental health conditions or anything like that, oh my gosh, the level of stress just is exacerbated, significantly, um,
Right.
through the roof. The amount of stress that you experience in those kind of situations, as soon as you introduce one of those things. I remember when my kids were young, and you kind of, through grad school and everything, you go through the series of, by about this age, this is when you would see, learning disabilities, or by this age, you would see this kind of developmental disability or something. And it's like, I remember as my kids were going through, it's like, okay, he made it to second grade and he's reading. Okay, so we don't have to worry about dyslexia right now. Okay, he made it to this age. We don't have to worry about this. And we made it to this age. But you can't imagine. It's hard to imagine if your child never went through any of those things. It's hard to imagine how it would shake your world if, suddenly at 4 years old, your child stops talking,
Mhm.
or if they're 2 years old and they're not walking yet, and you have to carry them everywhere. It just the additional stress and all that brings to your life is immeasurable.
Um, Years ago, back in the 80s, had to be in the 80s, there was a book published called A Place for Noah. And it was about a family in California. The father was a screenwriter. He wrote the screenplay for a movie called Harry and Tonto. It was about Art Carney starred in it, and he had a cat. Tonto was his cat. And the writer, Josh Greenfeld, was the man who wrote the screenplay. Well, they had a child with autism. This was back in the 70s, and the book was written in the 80s. They lived in Southern California, and so they had access to some pretty good facilities for children with autism. But in those years, autism was in its infancy.
Right.
So the book, A Place for Noah, the point of the book was there was no place for Noah. They reached a point where they could not take care of him in the home because he had violent outbursts. But there were no facilities and there were no programs. And even though they could access one of the best autism programs, Ivar Lovaas was a specialist in autism at the time. He happened to be in Los Angeles. I think he was at UCLA. And they were able to access his services. So they were able to access, because of his connections and his income, they were able to access these services. But in those years, the services were not that effective.
Right.
So here they have this child, and there was no place to put him. They had to keep him at home until they were able, when he was an adult and they could no longer take care of him, then he had to go to an institution,
Mhm.
which in those years didn't provide the kind of care they were hoping to have for their child. And what the book is about is that you are really on your own. We, as a culture, as a country, we don't have facilities for these people. And I'm not sure that that has changed dramatically in the past 40 years. I mean, I don't know what, if you have a child with moderate to severe autism, I'm not sure that there is really any place to put those children where they can be safe and managed well.
Right. Now, obviously, this kind of thing requires funding, and we won't get into all of the politics behind it,
Right. Right.
because that just gets so convoluted, and there's it's weird to say because it's not supposed to, but it elicits so much emotional reaction from people now. Uh,
Right.
as soon as you start talking about, government funded programs and,
Mhm.
things like that, I mean, you look at what happens in schools, and, we hope to send our kids to school to receive the services and support that they need. But, as funding keeps getting cut for different things, suddenly some of those services aren't available, or they're only available in two schools in the whole county or district that you're in. And so, you know, during election cycles, we hear about all kinds of things for, cutting taxes and cutting entitlement programs and things like that. My goodness, in some places there's fights and arguments about, feeding kids at school. Uh,
Right.
you know, school is, I've worked at schools where school is the only place that the kids ate.
Right.
That was where they had lunch. If they didn't go to school, they didn't have lunch or breakfast. And so, we keep cutting some of these things and cutting medical provisions and things like that for kids. All that does is increase and magnify the stress and that completely overwhelmed feeling that so many parents experience. We just have to recognize that it is an expensive venture, but man, what is it costing us to not have those services and supports?
Yeah, there are two ways to look at it. You say, well, it's too expensive. Well, so are roads and so are safe food. I mean, yes, it costs money to have safe roads and safe cars and safe drugs and safe food. Yeah, those things cost money. And so we're talking about children, we're talking about the future. We're trying to raise the next generation. But if you have a child with a chronic medical problem or a serious developmental delay, serious mental health condition, this gets far worse. Or if you're really, really, really poor, you talk about kids eating at school.
Hmm.
There are kids who once they don't eat in the summertime. Their food
Right.
intake drops dramatically in the summertime because they're not in school.
Yeah.
Or teachers will, we continue to be the wealthiest country in the world, but there are teachers who send food home with kids for the weekend so that they have some food to eat. They put food in the kids' backpacks so
Right.
there's
Well,
something to eat over the weekend. I
right.
mean,
Fortunately, we live in an area where we have a few programs. I believe they're funded by private programs, that give kids, packets
right.
for lunch over the weekends, and we have services where, kids can get meals during the summer where if the parents can get to the school, they can pick up lunch
Yeah.
for kids. But again, you just think about how unfortunate and sad that is because so many people, when you're thinking about this globally,
Right.
when the pandemic did hit, you know, I one of the schools that I worked at the time, the majority of students did not have internet at home. They did not have internet access
Right.
at home.
Hmm.
So we think of some of these base things that, well, everybody has access to the internet. Just go online and look at this up real quick. Well, you can't if you can't get online, if you don't have a computer at home.
Right.
We think of everyone having a computer. No,
Doesn't everybody have one?
huge
Right.
population, a huge portion of our population that don't have that access.
That's right.
Um, so we can't live in this delusion that everybody has access to all these things and that all this stuff is easy. There are families that are experiencing so much stress, so much distress, and just feel so, as this author talks about, so completely overwhelmed with all of this that,
Hmm.
you know, asking them to do one more thing very literally could be this straw that breaks the camel's back and just puts them into a tailspin.
Right. We have all heard about, well, in our profession, we've all heard about parents who are trying to access Medicaid services for their children or Social Security services for their children. And we've heard those stories about the
Right.
lengthy phone calls and the forms that have to be filled out. And it's like everything that parents do when they try to access these programs are obstacles to getting services. They're not ways, they're not pathways to services. You have to overcome all these obstacles. And so you're taking care of a child with special needs, but you have to devote hours every day just to access services that
Yeah.
should be available to these children. Same with veterans.
Right.
There's not a military veteran in this country who should ever worry about anything if they've been injured in any way in service. And yet they have to climb these mountains to
Mhm.
get services to which that should be easy to access. There should
Right.
be no obstacles in the way of handicapped children or veterans or people who have, through no fault of their own, are
Right.
facing these major challenges. And yet we hear people talk about, well, we have to cut Social Security and we have to cut Medicaid and we have to cut Medicare and we have to cut these government entitlement programs. No, no, no. These are the people who need it the most.
Right.
Let's give those citizens, these are fellow citizens we're
Right.
talking about. Let's take care of everybody. And so we should be making things easier for people, not more difficult. And I
Absolutely.
think that's the message in most of these articles.
Yeah, I think that the goal of the Surgeon General's essay was to raise awareness and say, hey,
Exactly.
yes, we all know that being a parent is stressful, but
Hmm.
let's look at what we actually mean. Let's look at what those actual sources of stress are
Hmm.
and see what we can do and think about what we can do to deal with that. And um, you know, we're going to talk much more about this in the next podcast because this is such an important topic.
Right.
Um, we're going to talk some more about the challenges with parenting today and try to offer some ideas and thoughts about that. But this was sort of an introduction to this idea and just to encourage people to think about what this job, again, that we voluntarily take on, what this
Mhm.
job means to us.
Right. And when we talk about the political parts of this, we often, and we have a thing in our field called cognitive behavioral therapy. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, we want to sort of change your vocabulary, change your story, change the way you talk to yourself. And when people hear about these government programs, whether it's food for impoverished kids or medicine or therapies or whatever, everybody, it sparks this thing about, well, that's government interference or that's government handouts and the word socialism comes up. We think about this is socialism, this is government interference. I think what Murty's article does is it says, let's think about this as a public health issue rather than a political issue. Let's
Right.
put it in the realm of, let's change our thinking and think about parent stress as a public health issue, not as some government. It's not socialism. This is about public health. And I think he's right. I think he's absolutely right about that.
Absolutely. So, as I said, we'll talk a little bit more and expand some more on this in the next podcast. And but certainly, if anybody has questions or comments or thoughts about that, we encourage you to
Right.
write to us and let us know, and we will be happy to try to address some of those things in future podcasts. So, until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.